I just recorded my entire video and I didn't realize that my backdrop was not showing all the way. So you could just see, oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. Let's try this again. Hello everybody, my name is Michelle and this is What Not to Do. The series where I talk about all of the mistakes that I've made while writing my novel. And today I'm talking specifically about world building. So what exactly is world building? Well, it's exactly what it sounds like. It is the process of building the world or setting that your story takes place in. So let me start by saying I love world building. Like I told you in my last video, I am a dungeon master. I run a lot of games, and world building has always been my favorite part of designing games for my players to participate in. Whether it's creating cultures, civilizations, religions, ecosystems, maps themselves, I absolutely love the world building process. This story takes place based off of a dream sequence that turned into a game that I ran. I told you about that in the last video, but what I didn't go into details about was that it wasn't just one game. I actually ran many games in the same world, just in different timelines, ranging all the way back to the beginning times where man is just starting to gain its own independence, all the way up to modern times where magic doesn't exist in our world anymore. So the question is, if I love world building so much, how did I mess up? Too much information. So, like I said, my story is based off of a game that I ran over the course of years, okay? So that's years worth of information, and it is impossible to condense down all of the information that you design when world building into a single novel. And you shouldn't do that. I mean it. Don't do that. It will bore the crap out of anybody trying to read your book. I have read many books where they try to jam-pack a ton of useless information into the story, so please don't do that. You want to focus on the relevant details. And that's kind of my first mistake, because what I found that I was doing is exactly what I told you not to do. I was trying to jam-pack irrelevant lore into my novel just because it was a story or a circumstance or something like that that I was really passionate about or that I really enjoyed. Let me give you an example. Back when I was running my game, there was a circumstance where a human killed a fae, and it was the first time in history that a fae died, at least that a fae was known to have died. And it was definitely the first time a fae was killed by a human. Up until this point, humans thought that fae, as magical creatures, were immortal. They thought that they were unkillable, mystical beings, basically. But this was a big eye-opener, and it waged a war. You had humanity battling against the fae, and the fae ended up splitting into two groups. You had the dark and the light fae, who both had different ideas of how to handle the humans as a human problem. And writing about that was something that I really enjoyed. I wanted to somehow mash it into my book. But it was completely irrelevant because that war happened thousands of years before my story takes place. It doesn't matter. I mean, it's cool. It's cool to know about, but it's irrelevant for the actual story. So focusing on those kinds of details, all kinds of irrelevant details, is really just a waste. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of focus that you could be spending on other things. So what should I have done? Well, what I should have done is I should have sat down and I should have thought to myself, what is relevant? What information from the past, from these old games, these old stories that I've basically been involved in, is relevant to my story plot, and I should have focused on those details and expanded on those details. Too little information. Now I know what you're thinking, but Michelle, you just said too much information is a problem. But too little information is just as bad when you have too little details about the important things. So in my case, like I said before, my story takes place in modern times, which means there's a lot of details I don't have to create from scratch because I can look at our world around us and use those as kind of like a framework. But what I should have done was thought about impacts, because how would our world be impacted if magic came to existence? What kind of impact would magic and magical creatures have on our world? What kinds of changes would we have? Would it impact science, weather, geography? How about society? How about the way we interact with each other? Would that change? Would humanity band together as a single united force? Or would we separate, divide ourselves even further out of fear or anger? I should have thought about those questions and then expanded on them. Because let's face it, if magic came into our world would change. Asking the right questions. As many right questions as you can. Because see, there are certain aspects of my world building I had already planned out. How does magic work? I already knew that. What time frame is my story going to take place in? I knew that too. But there is more details that I didn't really think about, I didn't ask myself, and I definitely didn't expand on. For example, how is language going to change? If you have magical races coming into our world that speak their own languages, how is that going to impact our concept of language? How is that going to change? Are we going to learn their languages? Are they going to learn our languages? This kind of evolution is something that I should have thought about. What kinds of impacts is magic going to have in our world? Is it going to affect our day-to-day? Is it going to affect our environment? Is it going to affect our nature? Let me give you an example here. You have these rifts that are opening up, and out of these rifts, magic from these different realms is spilling into our world as the creatures come through. Well, that's magic from their realms. Their realms are going to be completely different from ours or from each other. If you have demons coming from one realm and light fae coming from another realm, the effects on our world are going to be different in those two locations. In front of the demon portal, what are we going to see? Is it going to be ash-covered ground, constantly burning, rotting away, desecrating all of the life, plants, nature? In the other one, is it going to be plants blossoming, exploding in size, growing 10 times their normal size, sprouting tiny magical plants everywhere? You know, I thinking about these kinds of questions really helps you visualize how your world is going to look, which makes it easier for the writing process. Consistency. Write it down. Write it down. Write it down. I do not care if you are using WordPad, Notepad, or something way more complicated like World Anvil, but you have to write down the details as you create them as organized as possible, because you're eventually going to have to look those details up when you put them in your book. And if you don't, you end up like me, where you're trying to remember, wait a second, at one point I cast this spell before. What was that incantation? Okay, so I planned out all of the different members of the world government. Where did I write down those names? And you end up having to flip through your book, searching through your book for all of these details so that you can have some semblance of consistency. You don't want that to happen. Now, just because I say that, that doesn't mean that you have to write down everything in great detail. Because, like I said, relevance is key. You can just write down a blurb, a little reminder to yourself. There was a war thousands of years ago between light fae, dark fae, and humans. You don't have to write down pages upon pages of notes and details about it. Just something so that if that becomes relevant, maybe in another book, you have a basis to start from. But you do need to write it down so that you remember, oh yeah, that's right. This is going to happen, or this did happen at some point. Because remember, if your story is an adventure series where your characters are off fighting against an evil dragon that is trying to destroy a kingdom, it doesn't matter how many wives the emperor of that kingdom has. Not unless somehow those wives are connected to the story. Maybe one of the wives is working with the dragon. Or maybe one of the wives is part of your characters. Maybe the wife has run away and is now trying to help battle against the dragon. You know, if you have something like that where the wives are part of your story plot, then yeah, write down those details. Go into depth. But if it's not, then don't go into depth. Maybe write down Emperor has 7 wives and jot down their names. But that's really all you need to go into it, because it's not going to be part of your story, so you don't need to expand on it. You're just taking more time away from writing your book. Stop building. Please stop building. I know what you're thinking. Michelle, you've been talking about building more, going into more details, going into more depth. And that's true. It is important. You ask yourself these questions. You write down your answers. You delve on the things that matter. But once you have enough of those details, stop. It is time for you to start actually writing your book. Asking these kinds of questions can really help you determine how these different aspects of your world are going to impact your characters. Because that's the point. If you have a character who comes from a country that was decimated by a plague, that character's probably going to have specific feelings about science, medicine, doctors, possibly even nobility if the nobles separated themselves from the peasants as they were dying off from the plague. They may have an aversion to specific things or fears of specific things, and so that will help you develop your characters more fluidly. And so that's important. But what world building is not, is it's not about stroking your ego to say, I created a better world than you did. That's not the point. The point is to create a world that feels real to your readers. And I know you're thinking, well, come on, you're going to have magic in your world. Who knows what kind of fantastical creatures you're going to have? You've already mentioned fae, and that's vague as hell. So who knows what is there? What do you mean about realistic? Well, you still have to have it grounded in some sort of realism to where it feels like it's a world that people could live in and that people could react in specific ways to. So that's the point of world building. But once you have that information, once you're ready and you're at that step, stop building. So what do I do now that I messed up? Because let's face it, I messed up. Just get that out of there. Well, now I get to go through my book piece by piece as I'm editing it and take notes, which not only makes the editing process take longer and more tedious, but it makes this entire thing feel like a drain. It's like dragging down at me. But I have to do it because I have to have that information. I have to have it for consistency, and not just for this book, but I'm planning on writing a series, which means the next book, the information in this book is relevant. So I have to have some consistency there. And unfortunately, that's what I've got to work with. But if you take your time and you really ask yourself those questions and you focus on the important details and maybe jot down a few notes about those other details that don't really matter for your plot, just enough that you have a framework to go on. And you go through the process of writing it all down. You won't run into the problems I've run into. And you can write your book a lot smoother, a lot cleaner, and have a lot less of a hassle when you get to the editing phase. So please, don't be like me. Be smarter. Think about these things. Write it out, and hey, you could write a great book. Bye-bye.